Welcome to the American Association of Critical Care Nurses COVID-19 Support Podcast, Episode 6. Welcome to the American Association of Critical Care Nurses COVID-19 Support Podcast. I'm your host, nurse journalist Jamie Davis. Our goal is to discuss important nursing practices during the COVID-19 pandemic and offer tips for nurses on the front line or behind the scenes. We hear you, we're with you, and we support you. Thanks for joining us, whether you're listening in the car, at the house, doing everyday chores, or maybe just taking a quick break. In this podcast series, we will do our best to provide you with the most current information from our incredible community of nurses. However, you should always check with the nursing practice standards for the state in which you're licensed and working, as well as with the organization or healthcare facility where you work. Today we chat with nurse Emily Shands. Emily stepped up and offered to work in her hospital's COVID unit only months after graduating from nursing school. We'll explore how she found the confidence to work in the COVID unit so early on in her career, and what her time there changed about her views on nursing. Let's listen to Emily as she shares her experiences with a few special nuggets of advice she has for other nurses. Hi, Emily. Welcome to the show. It's great to have you here today. Why don't you take a few moments and tell us a little bit about your nursing experience before the COVID crisis struck?
I graduated from Texas Christian University in May 2019 with my BSN, got my RN licensure here in the state of Missouri. And in June of 2019, I started a 4-month critical care fellowship at Mercy Hospital, St. Louis. And I was training to be a nurse in the medical surgical ICU. And it included a preceptorship, so I felt pretty prepared for that aspect of entering into the profession. I switched over to night shift August 2019, and then in October, I was finally on my own, doing my own thing in the ICU. And ever since then, I've been in the ICU, and then in March, I was in the COVID ICU unit.
So tell us a little bit about the transition from when you ended up having a COVID unit and they started saying who wants to work here, because that, I think, is part of the story we want to hear about.
I think we kind of have to start at the beginning with how I first entered into the ICU. My manager warned us before we actually went in that there would be one person in each fellowship that was thrown curveballs, that was thrown, some crashing patients. And I just happened to be that nurse, actually. A lot of things, you learned quickly, and you saw rapid changes in condition, and you had to be thinking on the balls with your feet or whatever, and just, kind of roll with the punches there. And so when COVID came around, I felt scared. This is a pandemic that's being talked about in the news, and people are dying from this, and, there's the lack of PPE or resources are limited. So when I first heard about COVID coming to our hospital in St. Louis, I was pretty scared. And then I took a step back and I talked to my family about it and really weighed my options here. And they were really supportive of my decision to go work in the COVID unit. My father is in the medical field, so he was in and out of the hospitals too. Yeah, I just received a lot of support from my family. And that's kind of why I took a leap of faith and did the COVID unit.
So you'd had all these myriad of advanced experiences, I guess I would call them, in the ICU. And we all know that those things happen, and that learning curve can be steep for people. Did you feel that same way going into the COVID unit?
I think at first it was really challenging. A lot of us weren't prepared for, the level of PPE and going into these rooms and, where do we don and doff? And that was an additional challenge that, you faced, was just gearing up to go into these rooms, let alone coming face to face with this virus. The first couple of months, the first couple of weeks even, were definitely a challenge. And you kind of had to, just go in there with an open mind. Over time, you started to recognize what the pattern was. What did this virus look like? And what should you be, looking out for maybe tomorrow or the next day? Going in, I think that was also one of the reasons why I wanted to go work in the COVID unit was, if this is going to be as big as New York here in St. Louis, how do we prepare for that? How can I help others better prepare for that if I've done it kind of before it hits its peak.
And I'm curious, as you look back at those first few weeks, was there something you've identified that you might do differently? What would be that advice you'd offer to someone else in that same situation?
I think that clustering care was probably the first thing that I learned. I was going in and out of that room maybe every 30 minutes because, labs were ordered kind of haphazardly, and that's no one's fault at all. I didn't cluster my care. I wasn't going in with the medications and maybe drawing labs at the exact same time, or, the patient put their call light on, and it's so natural to walk into the room and, so what can I help you with, sir? These COVID patients, you should get on the video chat and, see what it is they need before you walk into the room. And so a lot of that was just learning. And then you started to understand, what can I do to prepare to go into this room? What can I bring the patient? What do I need to do to prepare this room for the next nurse?
When you think about being in the COVID unit, you talked about PPE and learning all the things that you had to learn a little differently, clustering care, certainly all important things. Was there anything in particular that was most difficult for you in the COVID unit as you were caring for your patients?
Family wasn't able to come to the bedside, and some of these patients were really critical. And so you're calling the family members, giving them updates as best as you can and as often as you can, but it's not the same as them being there at the bedside. So it was personally very hard for me to see a patient, on a ventilator, very sick, and there's not a family member there even to hold their hand. And something as simple as that, I felt that I could maybe spend 10 minutes of my time just doing and, praying over the patient, whatever it was, because I feel like if it was me in that bed, my family member might be doing the same thing. So I think that gave families some peace of mind that there was someone there in the hospital for them that was doing something a little different, that would maybe do something a little more geared to what a family member would do at the bedside. I don't know. I just didn't want them to be alone in there. And I know those rooms are so isolated. What would be another hard thing? Just the process. I mean, we're all going into this not really knowing. I know the doctors, respiratory therapists, techs, nurses, experienced nurses, we're going into this blind. Think back to March when you're hearing all of these, horrible things on the news and what's going on in China and Italy with the lack of ventilators. And so I think that gave me some courage, though, also, that everyone else was kind of in the dark here. And, only by putting our heads together and really working as a team were we could have come out successful from this thing. So
yeah, everybody was new, right? I mean, you were feeling new as a nurse, but to this situation, it was new to everyone, right?
oh, yeah. Like I said, that was helpful in a way because you're like, oh, I'm not alone here. I'm not the totally new nurse that doesn't know what they're doing. Everyone here really, I mean, it was a team effort. And I liked that a lot of the other nurses that you've interviewed so far have said the same thing, that this was a cohesive effort on everyone's part, just to do good by the patient, provide high quality care as best as you can in these uncertain times.
You're right. All the other nurses that we've interviewed have said some very similar things. One of the things that they've mentioned is the constantly changing either treatment patterns or advice methods of PPE donning even. What kind of things did you encounter, you and your colleagues, and how did you adapt to that?
I think that when we first started off, we were using one mask a day. And then that changed, of course, slowly over time. It was one mask for 3 days in a row. And now you need to discard, and we're going to repurpose these PPEs and the masks, and you'll get them again. So that was definitely shocking that, we would be reusing them, but, hey, things are changing all the time. You might as well just get on board with it. I felt like everyone was doing their best to maintain clean, safe environment. Another thing that changed was the MRI tubing. I don't know if you guys heard about that. The lines in the rooms allowed a nurse to titrate medications outside of the room. That was an infection risk too. So we actually had to limit our use of the MRI tubing at the end because we realized, this actually has a higher potential to cause infection because it dangles on the floor, whatever it is. We had monitors. Like when we went into the rooms, we had patient safety officers that stood kind of in the hallways watching us go back and forth, and they would tell us, hey, remember to wipe down your goggles or whatever when you come out of the room, because it's just habit to put it back on your head and keep walking out. So again, I felt safe, and I was glad for those reminders.
I've been heartened by your story and other people's stories of nurses caring for each other. What kind of examples do you have that you and your colleagues kind of forming that team to make this happen?
I'll start with the COVID corner. That's what we called it, because this hallway was angular and so long that you had, these four corners, and there would be maybe three nurses to one corner of this hallway. And so we called it COVID corner. And, we were a team back there. And so if you were in a room and you needed quick intubation drugs, hey, help, you're banging on the window or whatever it is. And people come running right away. And so that was our name for it. But I remember, I think it was probably my second week being in the COVID unit. My patient had taken a turn for the worse and needed to be prone, paralyzed, and heavily sedated, obviously, before all that happened. So proning is, when you put the patient on their belly and then you start the paralytics to improve their ventilation, once they've reached that ARDS point. That was my first ever time actually proning and paralyzing a patient. I've been seen it many times before, but me actually doing it myself. I walked on shift second week in the COVID unit, and the day shift nurse was walking out and she said, hey, I think you're probably going to prone tonight. I looked at the monitor and the patient sat in 84% oxygen.